Dr. Olowase Habasiane, the associate professor in the seminary, who is also our guest speaker, the president of IAS, the administrators of IAS, faculty, and friends. Good evening. I would like to welcome you in a very special way to the opening of the 14th AATA Annual Theological Forum. Before I give you welcome remarks, I would like to give the president of IAS, Dr. Stephen Gaptil, to come and give his welcome remarks. After our president, then the seminary dean will follow, and then the VP for academics. Thank you.
Well, I am delighted to be here this evening, and I am delighted to welcome you to this very, very special forum. Imagine 14 years of this, and who would have ever guessed that this would have blossomed and become such a renowned and excellent forum for not only for our African community here at IAS, but for our whole community, and not only just for our community, for the whole world in a sense, because of this opportunity. And so we are delighted that you are here. We're delighted that you are on this campus, especially to our honored guests. We are very blessed to have you here. Thank you for taking your time and being here to speak to us, and also Dr. Gabasiani, who will be one of our featured speakers as well. We are blessed to have you. Let me just share a few words about my approach to this outstanding organization. I think you have been drawn to this forum because not only of the outstanding speakers, but because of the fellowship of associating with people with similar kind of burden for the theology of our African community around the world. And certainly this theme, the Bible and culture, is a very special one. And not just any culture, but really related to those areas of Africa. You know, for the uneducated and those who don't know much about geography, you know, you might be tempted to think, well, that Africa is Africa. It's like a country. But it is so much more. So many countries, so many cultures, so many different people groups and languages and cultures. It is a huge opportunity to understand the challenges of the gospel and understand the people groups that we would seek to bring Jesus Christ to. This excellent association and forum has a reputation of attracting not only outstanding speakers, but a host of other presenters who provide remarkable perspectives and research to stimulate our thinking. And we are looking forward to that this weekend. You have made a wise choice, let me say, to come and participate in this. And we want you to feel welcome here on this campus. We hope you will have some time to look around the campus, to enjoy our library, to fellowship with our community here. And we pray that not only will this be an opportunity for you to grow in your understanding of biblical perspectives and culture, particularly African culture, but we pray that this also will be a spiritual growing experience for you. That as we talk about these subjects, as we hear these presentations, we will also be drawn to the wonderful God who created so many wonderful different people. And we praise him for that. Let this be a time for spiritual renewal for you as well. And welcome each one of you.
Good evening, and welcome to this forum. I was reading, some of the history of this forum and this, how can I say, association, that's the right word, thank you. And I was here when the association started. I was here and I was a classmate, with Pastor today, Dr. Sokupa, Dr. Akpa, Dr. Bediako, Dr. Verci, Dr. Patrick Anani. I mean, we studied English together in the English Center at the time when he came, and today when I read the names and I see where they are, I praise the Lord for the ministry of these servants of the Lord who walk the same path that some of you are also walking today, and that some of you also, or some of us also walked here in the past. I have to say that in thinking about what the forum means, allow me to say some of the things that are here, that I was reflecting on them as I was writing something about this forum. I have to say that Africa, for me, is a kind of mysterious but a rich and fascinating continent with a significant number of religious and cultural practices, perspectives of life, worldviews. Africa hosts more than 1 billion inhabitants in the world. And the northern part of this region has a long tradition in the history of the Christian church. Some of the great thinkers and apologists of the early Christian church ministered the word of the Lord in that land. And among those I can mention Tertullian, Athanasius, and Augustine. Huge, huge names for the Christian church today. They ministered in the northern part of that wonderful continent. Today, 54 countries, a variety of all kinds of cultural distinctness, challenges. They demand, I believe, in deep study, reflection, and the guidance of the Holy Spirit to succeed with the preaching of the gospel in that part of the world. I would like to say that I am very pleased as a seminary dean to see how this association has grown to where we are today. I was here at the time when it started, and I've been, since I came, observing the way how they are moving ahead. And I pray that the Lord will bless these meetings, that we will all be enriched by the presentations. And also I believe that it's very important to discuss this in a context in which we are all learning from what is happening here. Some of you will go back to your land to serve there. Some of you will be serving tomorrow in a different place. And some of you may be called to serve in a different continent too. And it's good to reflect, on the challenges that you are having in your own land, but I want to challenge you to think about the challenges that the church as a whole is having all over the world. I have to say that we thank you the presence of our guests today. I appreciate, they have come from their daily activities. They are here to be part of these meetings, and we are all, I believe we are all going to be blessed by their messages too. Thank you for being here. I hope that in this new experience that we will have this year, we will all be blessed. Thank you very much.
From the academic administration It is also a pleasure to welcome you. I will not make a long speech, but I will say that, I see AATA all about connecting. Connecting people with opportunities, connecting people with each other, connecting ideas and concepts, connecting Bible and culture. Both of these can be dynamic. Culture is dynamic, and our understanding of the Bible can also be dynamic. And the interaction of those, I believe, is what we are looking forward to in getting a greater understanding. So enjoy this connection over the next few days. I want to thank Pastor Lubani and his team for organizing this event. It takes a lot of work, I know, and it is your attendance here that is their reward, knowing that all their work and effort to try and connect these things is not in vain. Thank you, Pastor Lubani and your team.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gaptio, for the warm welcome, but also the speech you've made tonight. Thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez, the Dean of the Seminary, our father this side, for also honoring us this evening by your presence, and Dr. Oberhoster for all the support you give us as we are growing as an association. My singular responsibility tonight is to introduce our guest speakers, but also our keynote speaker. But allow me, before I introduce them, to make a few welcome remarks. In a very special way, I would like to welcome you on behalf of AATA. And I would like to say congratulations for making it to this anticipated August annual forum, which we are going to discuss very important issues affecting the Adventist Church in Africa, but also the church beyond. And we thank God for taking AATA this far and for bringing us together for the sake of our mother continent, but also for the sake of the mission of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. If you look at the thinking behind our theme tonight, what we're trying to make sure that we do at the end is to answer a very important question. Where do we place the dichotomy between African cultural practices and biblical principles? So this year's forum continues the discussion which began a long time ago. And together, as we ask each other questions and try to give answers to these questions, as we present papers, we're trying to find where we are going to place the dichotomy between African cultural practices but also biblical principles. Our keynote speaker and our guest speakers are outstanding scholars and distinguished theologians. And I would like us to take note that our speakers this year are a combination of both the laity but also the clergy. And in a very special way, I would like to mention that this year we did this deliberately because what we are trying to do is to make sure that there is a umbilical cord between AATA in Asia and the church in Africa. What does the church say? We strongly believe that whatever we are doing here will not have any effect if there is no connection with the mother continent. As a result of that, this year, you're going to note as I introduce the speakers that we have also brought a committed member of the church, but also an African, who is also going to share with us what it means to be a typical African, but also a typical Seventh-day Adventist. And as a result of this, allow me to ask Elder Zukim Koli to just stand up and just show us who an African is, but also who a Seventh-day Adventists from Africa may probably look like. Thank you so much, Elder Zukin Koli, for accepting our invitation to come to Asia and be with us. This year's forum also focuses on our annual, is actually the climax of our annual activities. We have actually witnessed a number of developments in AATA, and we thank God that this has taken us from one level of growth to another. In the year under review, AATA launched its website in order to make its globe presence more visible. If you visit our website, which is showing on our banner, you're going to find that you're going to access all the information concerning AATA, our profiles, our forums, including the previous forums, registrations, publications, news, and many other updates. And we'd like to encourage you to visit this website so that you can get to know what we've been doing ever since AATA came into being here at IAS. Another landmark development is the launch of the edited book, which has been written in honor of Dr. Stephen Gaptil for his service to IAS. This book is actually the product of the 13th AATA Annual Forum, and the book is entitled Health and Wholeness in Africa, a Biblical Foundation. Peer-reviewed essays in honor of Dr. Stephen Gaptil in celebration of his service to IAS community. What does the church say? We planned that this book should be launched during this forum. Unfortunately, our shipment has delayed. So we are going to announce shortly after the forum when we are going to do it. We're not going to launch the book, but the book is already on the way from Ghana, and it is simply the shipment which has delayed. But we praise the Lord for helping us to go this far. And allow me to mention that this project will be followed by another book project, which will be launched during next year's AATA Annual Forum. And the presentations that are going to be made here, the papers that are going to be read, are going to make part and parcel of the next book, which is also going to be launched next year. And we praise the Lord that God has given us the grace, but also the ability to embark on these wonderful projects, and we give him all the glory. I'm also profoundly grateful that AATA receives tremendous support from the IAS administration, and we are so grateful. Many times I've gone to the office of Dr. Gaptil requesting so many things, and we praise the Lord that we have a father in Dr. Gaptil that each and every time I've gone to him, sometimes with impossible requests, he looks at me, we talk about it, and then he says, you can go ahead. Thank you so much for that support. Many times I've also gone to the office of the dean of the seminary. Actually, from the beginning, when we began the process of developing the website, I went to the president, and the president said, I want you to work with Dr. Gonzalez. So we started working with him. He gave us advices on how we should go about it, and I've gone to him a number of times asking that question, this question, and thank you so much for the support you also give us. We are where we are today because of your support also. Allow me to also thank professors at IAS. As students at IAS, we are in the process of being molded. And honestly speaking, the papers we present and many other things you're going to be observing, it's because they also take time to guide us. We have enjoyed tremendous support of Professor Dioy Cruz, Professor Christian Dumitrescu. And I remember when we were launching our website, Professor Dumitrescu took time to talk to me about a number of issues, showing unprecedented support and making sure that we grow to a level where we can say that we are nicely cooked by this particular institution and seminary. And thank you so much, our professors, for that particular support. We also received tremendous support from different stakeholders, too numerous to mention, and most of them, I'll mention them on Sabbath. thank you so much for your support to this particular association. Briefly, but not the least, allow me to introduce our guest speakers. The first guest speaker I would like to introduce to you tonight is Elder Zuki Nkoli. Elder Zuki Nkoli is an international evangelist. He is also the preacher, but also director of Word Lives Ministry. And you may wish to know that Elder Zuki Nkoli is also the executive committee member of the General Conference. Elder Zuki Nkoli runs a successful architectural but also construction business. Living with his wife, Palesa, but also in Johannesburg. Palesa is a degreed fashion designer by profession who uses her skills and resources to donate to other charitable activities, but also many other activities. They're blessed with 5 children. As an evangelist, he always makes time to share about God's dealings and with real life issues, counsels, and speaks with professionals, business owners, influential leaders, and people from all walks of life. Elder Zuki Nkoli uses his property business, but also self-supporting ministry, which I've just mentioned, Word Lives Ministry, to donate state-of-the-art community benefiting buildings like churches, schools, clinics, and more. I wish we were prepared enough to show you some of the projects he has embarked in Africa, but also in North America, and even here in the Philippines. He has used all these resources in order to make sure that God's church and its mission is enhanced, and we praise the Lord for the great work, Elder Zuki Nkoli, you are doing. He also helps with consulting services to greatly minimize the construction costs of buildings by using his experience, skills, and resources. He is a true servant of God and a friend to humanity. And I strongly believe that we also take opportunity to consult with him on how IAS can also grow infrastructural wise. And I would like to ask Elder Zuki, I'm sorry, once again, to stand up and greet the IAS community. Thank you so much. We have developed a tradition here at IAS that each and every year when we'll be having our annual theological forums, one of our own professors will be the guest speaker. Last year we had Dr. Godwin Aja, who was the guest speaker, but also a local professor, and we thank you for the great work you did. And this year we decided to take Professor Oluwatse Habasiane. Professor Habasiane is the professor of applied theology at Adventist International Institute of Advanced Studies. He previously served as executive secretary, but also ministerial education director in Botswana Union Conference in the Southern Africa Indian Ocean Division. He worked as the director of development at Kanye Adventist College of Nursing, that is in Botswana. He also worked as an adjunct professor at Lake Michigan College, that is in Michigan in the US, but also Solusi College in Zimbabwe. He also worked for the Department of Mines in Botswana government, and he also worked with the Swana Diamond Mine in Jwaneng in Botswana. He is a holder of PhD in intercultural studies in mission, and he also holds the Master of Divinity in its equivalence at the same University of Andrews University in the year 2008. He has also a Master of Pastoral Ministry from Solusi University, Bulawayo, Zimbabwe. He is married to Ma'am Betty Chandapiwa Habasiane. They are blessed with 2 children, a girl and a boy, who are both studying at Maxwell Adventist Academy in Nairobi, Kenya. And the children's names are Itumeleng, who is in grade 12, and Seho, who is in grade 9. May I ask Professor Habasiane and Ma'am Habasiane to stand up and greet the IAS community. Thank you so much. You are welcome, Professor Habasiane. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, Professor Kwabena Donkor, allow me to introduce to you two friends. And this is a new trend altogether in AATA. In the past, we used to have presenters from IAS community, and maybe some would come from other sister institutions within the Philippines. But we are blessed this year to have people who have flown all the way from Africa to come here simply to present a paper and fly back. I thought I'll hear a hand clap on that. Allow me to introduce Pastor Phineas Mangwiro, who has come all the way from Zimbabwe to read his paper and fly back home. You are so much welcome, Pastor Mangwiro, and your coming this year is actually another trend in the growth of AATA. May God bless you. You may have your seat. We also have Pastor Blessing Nyahuma, who has flown all the way from Zimbabwe to read his paper and then fly back to Zimbabwe. And this is also another wonderful trend in the growth of AATA. Pastor Nyahuma, please, you may stand. Thank you so much. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Kwabena Donkor. Dr. Kwabena Donkor is the Associate Director of the Biblical Research Institute at the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist World Headquarters in Silver Spring, Maryland. A graduate of Andrews University, he earned his doctoral degree in systematic theology, affording him an avenue to explore his lifelong interest in connections between philosophy, science, but also religion. Prior to coming to the General Conference, Dr. Kwabena Donkor was employed at the Ontario Conference, that is in Canada, where he served as a district pastor for 11 years. He has written scholarly articles for journals, including Andrews University Seminary Studies, but also the Ministry Magazine, but also contributed to Millard Erickson et al. Reclaiming the Center, Confronting Evangelical Accommodation in Postmodern Times. Dr. Kwabena Donkor is an avid music lover and writes music at every affordable opportunity. He and his wife, Comfort, have one surviving grown-up child, and his name is Kwasi. In a very special way, ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Dr. Kwabena Donkor. And I would like to ask him to come in front to present his inaugural keynote address. And his keynote address is entitled Culture and Adventist Theology and Practice in Africa. Dr. Kwabena Donkor.
Thank you very much, brother. It's great for me to be here. I know that the association they have invited me several times, and I couldn't. But this time I said I will have to come this time. Because, you know, when you begin growing old, you begin to think about retirement. And I didn't want to retire knowing that I never came for the forum. So I decided to come this time, and I'm glad to be here. I was telling them when they picked me up, I almost became a professor at this place just before I left for Biblical Research Institute. I was actually appointed to come, but in the meantime, while they were looking for the interdivision budget, the BRI called me, and so I went to the BRI. So I'm very pleased to be here. I want to talk about something that is really important. I hope it is accessible to you. I've tried to make it accessible, but some of these things, that's the nature of the beast. So I hope you come along with me. But this is a very important issue that I think as a church, we need to attend to culture and Adventist theology and practice in Africa. What I'm trying to show is how culture, African culture, has kind of inserted itself into African thought and African theology, and the shape it has had in theological discourse in Africa. Towards the end of it, I will try to raise some concerns that should be addressed, and I will try to address some of them in my next presentation when I deal with hermeneutics. But for now, I want to show how Africa has imbibed culture into our thinking and into our theology, and the ways it's taken African theologians sometimes. So culture, Adventist theology, and practice. This flag, so I guess I may have to step down. I think it's also black. Okay. All right. The flag, I think it will be better, yes. One of the facts that we confront, and that is not disputed, is the fact that among African scholars, there has been a resurgence of culture within African thought. And when you think about the realm of religion, the interface is between missionary Christian activity and African traditional religion. So this is where, when you want to talk about how culture is showing up in Africa, in African theology, you think about the interaction between African traditional religions and traditional Christian missionary activity. One of the things that has raised this issue is the continuing vitality of African traditional religions. And so you come to think about it. In spite of all these many years of missionary activity, homage to ancestors is still very real in Africa. When you think about divinations, all kinds of divinations, you find them in Africa. Rituals, sometimes even among Seventh-day Adventist members, we are involved in certain rituals that we know really are not kosher as far as the church is concerned. When you think about the vitality of the African traditional religion, we need to ask, what is going on? So people have raised questions about the legitimate relationship between Christian religion and the African traditional religion. How should they be related in view of the vitality of the African traditional religions? And I want to say that the new face of African traditional religion is what we know in scholarship to be post-colonial African theology. So if we are going to talk about the resurgence of culture, let us have at least a brief understanding of what culture is all about. You know, when you look at the etymology of culture, it began within the field of agriculture. But today, when we talk about culture, it has an anthropological sense. Therefore, culture is everything about a group that distinguishes it from others, including social habits and institutions, rituals, artifacts, categorical schemes, beliefs, and values. Now, look at that definition carefully. When you are talking about people's habits, institutions, their rituals, and so forth, you are really dealing with the identity of the people. And this explains why culture is seriously connected with post-colonial theory that I'll be talking about in a few minutes. And so the issues that we deal with in religion and culture in Africa are connected at the roots, at the foundation. They are connected with post-colonial theology or post-colonial thought. Now, what's post-colonialism? Post-colonialism can be seen as a historical marker or a theory. As a historical marker, post-colonialism refers to the period from after colonial rule to decolonization and events connected with decolonization in the 1970s and 1980s. So that is when you talk about post-colonialism as a historical thing, as a temporal marker. This is the period after colonialism. But connected with this is post-colonialism as a theory. And that is where I want to dwell a little bit. Post-colonialism as a theory. And I have some names there for you. We are thinking about theorists like Said, Baba, and Spivak. Now, what these theorists do is that they take post-colonial themes and refract it or pass it through post-structuralist theory. That's a lot of stuff I'm saying there. But let's break it down. So in other words, when these theorists take anything within the post-colonial experience of Africans and try to understand it, they try to understand it within the context of what is known as structuralist and post-structuralist theory. Now, if you have read people like Foucault or Derrida, these are the people I'm talking about. And what is the essence of structuralism or post-structural principles? What they claim is that all systems, any system, systems are not innocent expressions of reality, but systems encode power structures. So in other words, if you were to understand the system that we have set up here at IAS, they would say this is not necessarily a reflection of how reality should be. These are encodings of power. Therefore, what they try to do is to deconstruct structures and power systems. And so, post-colonial thought or post-colonial theology will take anything in, for example, African traditional religions, and show how this is really a structural thing, a power thing. They would take Christianity also and say, this is not how it's supposed to be. Christianity is embedded with power structures. Those of us from Africa, you understand how there was a time, and that's the time I'm going to be talking about, when we believed that the white man brought us Christianity, and he brought us also Western culture. And that within the culture, they tried to use Christianity to oppress the Africans. This is the kind of stuff I'm talking about. So you feel and hear echoes of postmodernism in post-colonial thought. I don't know how many of you are old enough to have heard about negritude. When I was young, this was the thing. Negritude, they claim, this is Kenzo, is a post-colonial movement. And most importantly, however, negritude or blackness echoes postmodernism on a number of points. So now you are beginning to get an idea of what post-colonial thought is concerned. Notice the relationship they are establishing between post-colonialism and postmodern thought. First, the post-colonial movement expresses disenchantment with and criticism of the hegemony of Enlightenment reason. This is modernity. Post-colonial thought rejects that, and postmodernism also rejects it. Second, it affirms and exalts the plurality of epistemic spaces. In other words, there is no single way of knowing reality or truth. There can be many ways, and they are all legitimate ways. This is what negritude affirmed, and this is what postmodernism also affirms. Third, it illustrates the radical historicity of all knowing. In other words, there isn't any standard way of knowing. With time, there is dynamism, so knowledge evolves, and there is no one sacrosanct way of knowing. This was negritude. This is postmodernism. Fourth, it attempts to recuperate the past. So don't let them tell us that the past was all paganism. Let's bring it back and see what it has to offer. Faith, over against discursive reason, that is the kind of reason that we have been taught in school, the Greek way of thinking. Over against discursive reason, both negritude and postmodernism champion an aesthetic reason that transgresses modern conventions. This is the frame of mind of post-colonial thought that has linked up with African culture to insert itself in theological thinking. So what are they doing? They want to recognize the theoretical connection between post-colonialism and postmodernism. And this is helpful because when you understand this connection between post-colonialism and postmodernism, you begin to understand the way culture is beginning to function in African theology. This writer here, actually, Mbembe, characterized post-colonialism as the revenge of paganism. And you know, when he said this, he was kind of highlighting the failure of modernity to kill paganism. And he uses paganism to stand for everything that African stands for, because that's what the colonialists told us. Everything was pagan. But he's saying they survived. And post-colonial thought is to revive this thing that modernity could not kill. And so when you think about post-colonial theology, there is a lot of what I call localizing tendencies. I mean, this is plurality. What is in Zimbabwe, this kind of culture, what is in Ghana, that kind of culture. These are all good. Let us revive them. That is what they are all about. It goes deeper, and I'll get into it. So, post-colonial African theology, which is the resurgence of culture into theology in Africa, was destined to focus on culture. Why? I'll explain. During the colonial period, the whole colonial experience was conceived as the ordering of minds of a people without history and civilization. This is how the colonial masters saw Africa. They saw Africans as a people without history and without civilization. You know, I'm interested in philosophy. And one of the philosophers I loved most, I used to love most until I came across this quote, is Friedrich Hegel. Now, friends, these are important, and I'm not here to criticize Western powers or anything, but I want us to get beneath what we are dealing with. So the colonial mentality was that these people from Africa have no history. They have no civilization. So let us order their minds in a way that they would have history and civilization. Friedrich Hegel, if you understand his thought at all, saw reality as the absolute spirit developing. This is important to me, so I want you to get it. This was idealism. What is real? There is an absolute worldwide spirit that is developing. And as it develops, it comes to a point where it puts in place what we call a thesis. But as the spirit develops, something will kick against the thesis and bring an antithesis. So the thesis and the antithesis will be now struggling. In the course of the struggle, there will be a synthesis. And that synthesis becomes a new thesis. Then there will be another antithesis. There will be another synthesis. And that way, civilization moves along, reality develops, things improve. This was Hegel's thought. listen to what I've told you all of this to tell you what he said about Africans. The realm of the absolute spirit, now you understand what I mean. The absolute spirit, the spirit of the whole reality that is moving along. The realm of the absolute spirit is so impoverished among them, the Africans. And the natural spirit so intense that any representation which they are inculcated with suffices to impel them to respect nothing, to destroy everything. Africa does not have history as such. Consequently, we abandon Africa to never mention it again. It is not part of the historical world. It does not evidence historical movement or development. Do you get what he's trying to say? So the whole world is moving on as reality. But don't let Africans have a part of it. They have no history. The point I'm making is that post-colonial African theology, you can imagine, was bound to fight this kind of thing. Can you see it? So one of the primary tasks of post-colonial independent Africa is to reconstruct African history as a way of, if they were ordering the minds of Africans, disordering the minds of Africans. That's one of their goals. This history, which they will reconstruct, will stress the value of African societies, their cosmologies, their customs, their systems of knowledge, their emphasis on community, and their central religious values, practices, and attitudes. You see where we are headed now? If this is what the colonialists did, this is our reaction. So most of these African theologians, bright minds, this is the agenda. They held an ecumenical association of African theologians in Accra, Ghana, 1977. And Kofi Appiah-Kubi, who is a Ghanaian, had this to say: our question must not be what Karl Barth or Karl Rahner or any other Karl has to say, but rather what God would have us do in our living concrete condition. For too long, African Christian theologians and scholars have been preoccupied with what missionary A or theologian B or scholar C has told us about God and the Lord Jesus Christ. This, friends, is the agenda. And so, the precedent had been set for a theological reflection whose methodology would not try to adapt European or Western theology to Africa, but one that would arise from historical reflections on African social, religious, and political realities, albeit from supposed Christian commitments. So what I'm saying is that these people are Christians, but they are going to do their theology as Christians by reflecting on African history, society, political realities, and our religious convictions as we find in African traditional religions. So they are doing this from Christian commitments. And these are their methodological assumptions. So they deny universal theology. Why? Because this is the theology that has enslaved us. So there's nothing like a universal theology. Remember, structuralism, it's all systems of power. There is no universal theology. Second, a non-exclusive, pluralistic approach that embraces the theology of indigenous religious forms, including Islam. It's now pluralism. A view of history in which God speaks to all peoples in particular ways. Fourth, an African theology whose cultural context is the diverse cosmological worldviews of African peoples and societies. And you know what? If you are talking about the different places in Africa, you go to different parts of Africa, they have all kinds of cosmologies. And they are saying, let us mine these things and do our theology from there. 5, a recognition of African culture as the particular loci of God's presence. So you look at the African culture, you see those things going on there. This is how God has been present in the culture. An acknowledgement of African perceptions and constructions of space and time to be central to the understanding of life and death. So, for example, as an African, I remember when I was growing up, my father used to have matatu, one of these trotro, and my father would be driving in the night and he would come across a river in Ghana, and when he comes across a river, he honks. And I said, so why do you do that? And my father was a district elder. But you have to honk because the goats might be bathing their kids. And if you don't and you hit them, your whole car will be overturned. This is the way Africans conceive of space and time. And they are saying that when we do this kind of post-colonial theology, we must embrace the Africans' conceptions of space and time as part of it. Number 7, an understanding of worship as essentially an elaborate series of manipulative rituals designed to harness the resources of good deities in order to ward off the machinations of the evil spirits and to control space-time events. Now, we don't have time to go through all of these things, but those of you who know about the African traditional religions and the charismatic churches that have arisen in Ghana, you know how there's all kinds of manipulation. Friends, this is now the influence of post-colonial theology. So what do? You bring olive oil and you bring this and these are all Christian churches. You bring them and you manipulate stuff to get things done for you. That is what they are saying. 8, a definition of humanity as being in relation. In all of this, there is a central issue. The African's identity. The question of identity. And my fellow countryman and I really wanted to meet this man, but he died a few years ago, so I couldn't meet him because he's so brilliant, but I needed to have a chat with him. Kwabena Donkor. He says Africans ought to be authentic Africans and true Christians. Now, his argument is that we have been sold a bill of goods, but that has denied us from being true Africans. Now, his whole theological reflection was to ensure that the African will be authentically African and also a true Christian. And for him, the issue of identity lies at the heart of the very theological exercise. So it's not like, what they say, okay, we know the Bible, and then now let's do contextualization. So we take the Bible. And that's what he's talking about. What he's saying is that in the very process of doing theology, the African's identity must be brought to bear. Identity lies at the heart of the process by which the Christian theological enterprise is actually carried forward. That's what he's saying. You know why he said that? All of these guys studied in Britain. But this is what they realized. And those of you who are Africans, you can sympathize with this. How many times did you hear in our churches in Africa fighting about, justification and sanctification and sola scriptura? And when did you hear them fight about those things? No. What they said, they noticed is this. Areas of traditional Christian doctrine which are not reflected in the African's past disappear or are marginalized. Because they went and studied Western theology and they came back and they realized that not much of this is significant for these people. A lot of the stuff we talk about in theology, especially those of us who have done systematic theology, has no concern for Africans. Those are marginalized. What do the Africans have interest in, they say? They are anthropological concerns. And if you want to address the issue of identity, then these anthropological concerns must be taken into account. And he says, if you do that, then it can be said to have been an endeavor to demonstrate the true character of Christian identity. If you are not doing that, and you are reading Millard Erickson, and you are reading this, and you are reading that, you haven't touched theology as far as Africans are concerned. This is what Kwabena Donkor was all about. African theology must endeavor to demonstrate that conversion to Christianity ought to be joined with cultural continuity. You cannot be converted, he says, and lose your Africanness. Specifically, the primary worldview of African cultures should be seen as an aid to the Christian faith and appropriated accordingly. We must address the issue of what was the nature of the saving activity of the one living God through the centuries prior to the incarnation of the Savior and the inauguration of the Christian era. So what he's saying is that let's go back into our history. What do we see? Centuries before Christ, what was in Africa? Let's look at them. And even after Christ, let's see how we can mine the African past and conjoin it with the Christian faith. John Mbiti from Kenya, in this same tradition, says, a study of these, that is African traditional systems, a study of this religious system is therefore ultimately a study of the peoples themselves in all the complexity of both traditional and modern life. And this, friends, is significant, he says. Religious traditions of Africa constitute some type of preparatio evangelica. In other words, the African cultures, their rituals, their systems, these were all preparations of the gospel in Africa. Also, another prominent post-colonial theologian, Bolaji Idu from Nigeria, questions whether in the past pre-Christian history of Nigerians, God has ever in any way revealed himself to them, and they have apprehended his revelation in however imperfect way. Whether what happens in the coming of Christianity and as a result of evangelism is that Nigerians have been introduced to a completely new God who is absolutely unrelated to their past history. He's asking the question, it's almost a rhetorical question. In other words, he's saying, so do you want to suggest to me that before Christianity came, we didn't know God? And that what the Christians brought was a completely new God? Bediako has reflected on it, and that's why he says, the gospel is saving truth, but that truth was known partially and savingly. That's important. Yes, not knowing it. It was known partially and savingly in the pre-Christian worship of African traditional religion. It gets deeper as Bediako reflects on soteriology. You know, when we talk soteriology, we talk Christ, his being, his works, and so forth. But this is now the new phase of soteriology for post-colonial theology. Since salvation in the traditional African world involves a certain view of the realm of spirit power and its effects upon the physical and spiritual dimensions of human existence, our reflection about Christ must speak to the questions posed by such a worldview. The needs of the African world require a view of Christ that meets those needs. And so, who Jesus is in the African spiritual universe must not be separated from what he does and can do in that world. In other words, like Mbiti said, the soteriology that will win the day in Africa is the soteriology that consists of Christ as a magician. who has power to do things for the African. So I'm beginning to do some evaluation now with all of this. Now, this is the nature. This is how the African culture is beginning to get reflected in Christianity in Africa. But there are some issues that we need to grapple with. It's not that simple. And anybody who buys into this totally will have to grapple with these questions. Number one, if indeed African traditional religions is in continuity with the Christian faith, here is the question. How do you then account for the mixture of positive and negative elements in African traditional religions? You see where we begin to get a struggle. Because within the African traditional religions, polygamy, for example, is not an issue. But if ATR is in continuity with the Christian faith, how do you explain why that traditional religion allows things like polygamy and still claim that it's in continuity with biblical faith? It's a question to wrestle with. Second, if you would embrace everything that post-colonial theology is saying, then you need to do a rigorous theological account of the universal significance of Christ. In other words, Christ is not just a local figure. Christ is a universal savior. Now, how do you then account for this? There are people like John Poby from Ghana who has said that we need to conceive of Christ as an ancestor for it to be relevant for the Africans. But then questions remain. Because when you look at Africans and their ontology, there is a certain path to become an ancestor. How does Christ become an ancestor without the clan system? That is a problem. When also you conceive of the African traditional religion as in continuity with Christian faith, you have to contend with this problem. What you have then done is to conceive of conversion not as an antithesis, as we would say, but rather as a fulfillment. So it's not like you meet an African and you are confronting something to get conversion. But if you see ATR and African and the Christian faith as continuous, then it's only a fulfillment and not an antithesis. This is what we Adventists would teach. That remains a problem. The other issue that has to be wrestled with is bypassing the question about identifying the center of religious belief and activity. I mean, when you do systematic theology at Andrews or here, I believe, the first thing you are taught is that the center of all theology is God. But all people who have dealt with ATR will tell you that the center of ATR is man. Anthropocentricity. God is not a central focus of religion for his own sake. Now, don't get me wrong. In my language, we have a proverb like, nobody teaches a child God. Meaning that a child is born and they know God. So God is a great center in African religions. But God is not sought in the African religion for his own sake. God is sought for what God can do for man. That is the anthropocentricity we are talking about. For African regions, it is man at the center and what man can get for the good life in this world. This is the center of ATR. How do you now configure that with the theology that you have been brought up with, that God is at the center for his own sake, for his creation and his redemption. This is why we worship him. We don't worship God because of what he does or does not do for us. That becomes a real problem. There are also practical issues, and I just here give some quotations to show you that some people are bringing up things that are problematic. Charles Nyamiti, I think it's from Kenya, I believe, says African religious behavior is centered mainly on man's life in this world, with the consequence that religion is chiefly functional, or a means to serve people to acquire earthly goods, life, health, fecundity, wealth, power, and the like, and to maintain social cohesion and order. Consequently, post-colonial African theology inclines the African Christian life towards an anthropocentric, materialistic view of Christianity. This is gone. Contemporary African Christianity is growing tremendously in part because of the neo-Pentecostal charismatic salvific discourse that treats material well-being as if it were an end in itself. Although the prominence of this salvific discourse is complex, it will be argued here that African neo-Pentecostal charismatic Christianity draws from a source that has always informed African Christian theology in general, African traditional religious thought. And so, this insertion of culture into African theology has not been without people who have raised concerns. This is Peter Ozodo, who was chair of the Nigerian Evangelical Missions Association in 1999. He wrote, "A significant segment of the Christian church in this country is gradually but steadily departing from the basic goals of Christianity. The entire church is in danger of losing its basic direction." And now the African Religious Union of the Catholic Church, Ghana, wrote this. They said that the proliferation of churches is gradually undermining Christianity. And if you have been to any parts of West Africa, you understand what I'm talking about. And you begin to wonder. You begin to wonder what is going on. There is a guy from my country who claims that he is the brother of Christ, and that if you trouble him, he will come into your dreams. All kinds of things, and people throng to these people. Gradually, Christianity is being undermined. So let me do a summary of post-African theology, and then I will do a simple Adventist assessment. And if you can get the whole paper and read my argumentation there. So this is what post-colonial African theology is telling us. The African's identity is inextricably bound with his or her past, which theologically is defined by the worldview of traditional African religion. For this reason, it is argued that if the African would remain truly African and authentically Christian, a synthesis must be sought between the Christian faith and the traditional African religious worldview. And this is based on a supposed continuity between the African's past and the Christian faith. There are ecclesiological implications for this, because it brings in now the primal African worldview into the church's constitution. If that happens, material well-being comes to the heart of the church's mission and pastoral care. Also, since the contours of African traditional religions are varied, the result of their incorporation to the church will be varied and necessarily pluralistic. But we need to evaluate this from an Adventist ecclesiological viewpoint. Number one, on the issue of identity. See, Adventist ecclesiology is a remnant ecclesiology. I don't have time to unpack all of that. Our understanding of the church is not like anybody else's understanding as Adventists. We believe in the concept of God's people from the Old Testament moving on through Christ, who becomes the true remnant and then we come to Revelation, which we are studying, the remnant in eschatological times, where the Adventist church sees its identity. So our understanding of the church is a remnant ecclesiological understanding with a particular missiological outlook, particular soteriological outlook, all kinds of outlook that feed into this ecclesiological understanding. For us also, when you think about continuity, you know how the AATA is talking about continuity with the African traditional past and Christianity. For us, it is not the African past that is the element of continuity. For us, this remnant ecclesiology, which emerges from the concept of the people of God in the Old Testament, is the principle of continuity. Not any culture, African, Asian, Indian, or whatever. No culture has that continuity with the Christian faith. It's the principle of God's people maintained through time, through the concept of the remnant that constitutes God's people. So the children of God and people of God is the new identity. When I become Adventist, I belong to the people of God with its past and future implications. That is my identity. Somebody has said it nicely. By entering into the kingdom of God, they are identified now, you and I, in relation to the history of that kingdom. They have become a part of God's salvation history. Thus, insofar as the identity of Gentile believers like you and I are concerned, this identity has a backward-looking orientation. It is not found in their own religious past, but in that of Israel. However, finding their identity in Christ, in fact, moves the orientation of the identity away from the past toward the future. And with regards to the future, remnant ecclesiology forecasts a future problem with identity, rooted not in ethnic traditional ties, but in the everlasting gospel of Revelation 14, 6 to 14. Second issue of anthropocentricity. Those theologians and practitioners who are committed to framing African Christianity within the categories of African theological thought, they are enthralled by the miracles and the spiritual encounters because they said this is the Christology that responds to the Africans' needs. So they see these miracles and the growth of the Pentecostal church. They say, wow, this is now Christianity becoming really African the way it should be. But if you have an Adventist remnant ecclesiological outlook, you look at it differently. Because why? As we have studied in the Sabbath school, in the closing scenes of the great controversy, things are fraught with deceptive spiritual activities. Remember in Revelation 16, you talk about the frogs that come out of the beast of the dragon and the false prophet. And these are powers that go around to deceive and prepare people for the great battle of Armageddon. So Adventists are careful. The fact that these churches are doing miracles and people are flocking to them doesn't necessarily mean that they are kosher. It's because of our ecclesiological understanding that we are careful. John Pauline, who is a Revelation scholar, has suggested that in the context of the end time, this development points to a strong role for spiritualism unifying the world for a common cause. 3, there is also a methodological difference. We as Adventists, we embrace the sola and tota scriptura principles that avoids any hermeneutical principle that usurps Scripture's authority. So in the traditional formulation of the solas, it wasn't councils or popes or tradition or anything that was the regular fide. No. It was the Bible and the Bible alone. Now, post-colonial African theology intends a principle of correlation between the Bible and the AATA. And I haven't had time to develop this here now, but I have it in the paper. So you take Africa and their religious past, and you take the Bible and you do some kind of correlation. Those of you who know the theology of Tillich, that's what he did. A principle of correlation that is for me, quite compromising and risky. So that is all I have to say to you about how culture is inserting itself into African theology and how I think there are problems with it. This is a lot of food for thought, and I hope we can digest it and pass it and truncate it or do whatever we can in the course of this session. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Donkor, for a wonderful, groundbreaking keynote address. Let's give him another round of applause. In the interest of time, let me call upon the next presenter and the next moderator. If we have any question, please, let's just write it in our notebook. As we go on with our forum, we'll give our keynote speaker an opportunity to respond to the questions which we have concerning the keynote address he has just made tonight. So I would like to ask Brother Mboneza Kabanda to introduce our next speaker. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pastor. The second presenter is Pastor Cruz DOE. He has a good subject. Inculturation, Biblical Hermeneutics in Africa, Origin, Implications, and Guiding Principle for Adventist Mission. Welcome, Pastor. I want to say that Dr. Cruz, he's an associate professor here in IAS, and he is an African. Yes, he has passed many years in Africa. He speaks French, Spanish, Portuguese, English, and many more languages from Africa. Welcome, Pastor, for the presentation. May we welcome him with a big applause. Thank you, Pastor.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm not an African, but I have a son who is an African. He was born there, although he's a little white, but he's still an African. And when he goes through the airports, people ask and look at his face and look at his passport and see what's wrong here. Anyway, I'm sure that some of you may be feeling a little uncomfortable looking at me dressed in this way, right? Of course, you are people who live in IAS, and in IAS we can dress anyway, right? That's the good thing about IAS. But if this forum were held in Fiji or in Tonga, Pacific Islands, the way I'm dressed would be the most appropriate one. During formal and ritual church meetings, this is how our brothers dress themselves. Although the Bible does not explicitly ordain our Adventist brothers to wear a Western tie and a Fijian Sulu in such meetings, it is fully accepted as Christian form with biblical meaning. However, this is not inculturation, but acculturation. And they have opposed meanings, and I will share with you during this presentation. The title of the presentation is Inculturation Hermeneutics in Africa, Approaches, Implications, and Guiding Principles, Biblical Principles for Adventist Mission. So, considering the globality of the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its constant expansion, inculturation hermeneutics is an important method of interpreting the Bible, particularly in the African diverse cultural context where there is an increasing awareness of the autonomy of the church, like we have seen in the previous presentation. Thank you, by the way, Dr. Donkor. A great introduction for my paper. Confronted with cultural centrism, the church needs to maintain unity in diversity in order to strengthen its global mission strategies. It is in this context that the struggle for the inculturation of the gospel in Adventism in Africa is perceived by local churches as a priority and an urgency. The dialogue between biblical hermeneutics and cultures has serious ecclesiological implications and remains a difficult path for the Seventh-day Adventist Church and its theology, as we have seen a few minutes ago. In this study, I will provide a brief description of enculturation hermeneutics and its implications, indicating its possibilities and limitations. Second, I will consider perspectives of hermeneutics as tools for faithful enculturation of the gospel, and will conclude by recommending practical ways to develop a biblical and relevant model of enculturation of the gospel in the Adventist African context. Therefore, this presentation should be understood as a study in trends and perspectives and not as the final word on the subject matter. The term enculturation, as applied to Christianity, denotes the presentation and re-expression of the gospel in the forms and terms proper to a culture. It results in the creative reinterpretation of both, without being unfaithful to either. Evangelization respects culture as part of the human phenomenon and as a human right and repels sin. The manipulation of oppression of culture is therefore an abuse. Culture is a coherent system of meanings embodied in images and symbols that enables the individual to relate cognitively, emotionally, and behaviorally to the world and to communicate this understanding to others. So culture is then the prism through which a human society views the whole of its experience, domestic, political, social, economic, and it's learned by the human being through socialization, and it's developed throughout life. It gives identity to human groups and controls its perception of reality. For the purpose of theology, it is at once more positive and more precise than the term context. Syncretism denotes an anomalous conflict of meaning when, in the process of evangelization, cultures domesticate the gospel and distort its meaning. No culture is deemed to be unfailingly Christian, since enculturation is a constant call to conversion and to renewal. Some questions for our consideration before we continue. Can enculturation provide a fertile ground for incorporating the culture of particular peoples into the life of the church without ignoring the absolute, universal, normative principles in the Word of God? Second question, where is the borderline between enculturation and syncretism? How can Adventist global mission leaders disconnect mission strategies from the missionary concept of evangelization as a one-way traffic and connect to a process that is interactive and complementary? I believe it's through enculturation that the church will reappraise global mission so as to maintain and exceed the present successes and redefine its orientations and goals. What distinguishes a hermeneutics that cultivates the meaning of difference and a hermeneutics of pure assimilation? Having said that, I'd like to affirm that enculturation is a term often used by Catholics, by the World Council of Churches, and some Protestants, while other Protestants and Adventists also prefer to use the term contextual theology. The word enculturation or contextualization raises questions and fears in some minds. Some understand it as rejection of the supremacy and authority of the Bible for the sake of being culturally relevant. Others fear it means watering down the gospel of making conversion easy for the sake of big conversion, numbers, statistics. Others are resistant afraid to even bring in culture into discussion of how to study and share the Bible cross-culturally. These fears are not necessary when enculturation is understood and practiced in a biblical way. For example, in Catholicism, enculturation involves the adaptation of the liturgy to different cultures and the tolerance of various pagan practices that are deemed part of the traditional culture. But enculturation is not an exclusively Catholic practice. Anytime the gospel is presented in a new culture, the matter of enculturation must be addressed. Therefore, in this article, I argue that enculturation is the contextualization of biblical teachings in a non-Christian or secular culture. Not to be confused with enculturation or acculturation, which is the process by which people adopt the behavior patterns of their surrounding culture and acquire values and norms appropriated or necessary in this culture and worldviews. According to Jeffrey, the first condition of enculturation in contemporary church Christianity is respect for others, worldviews. One must show interest in a type of man who is culturally and religiously foreign to me. For example, I must therefore go beyond my spontaneous prejudices and keep myself from stay in the comfort zone of what is already known to me or what seems to have some similarity with my own word or thought. Even though the history of Christian missions has too often been marked by imperialist conquests and the non-respect of other cultures, this recognition of foreigner belongs to the roots of the Judeo-Christian tradition. For example, when the Apostle Paul, the Jew who became a Christian, refuses to subject the Gentiles to the rite of circumcision, he shows respect to others in their differences. Many parables of Jesus testify to this respect of the foreigner and his strangeness. In this respect, one should reflect on what distinguishes hermeneutics that cultivates the meaning of difference and hermeneutics of pure assimilation. There is an old principle that goes back to the Greek philosophy, that of Parmenides' philosophy of identity, when he said, "Only the alike can know the alike." Parmenides' philosophy dominated all Christian theology and influenced the missionary strategy of the church at a time when the Christian mission coincided with the expansionist will of the Western nations. It should be replaced by another principle that has its sources in biblical tradition, namely the dissimilar recognizes the other in their otherness. So this would be the only way to overcome a totalitarian conception of Western men. Enculturation should never favor a cultural relativism that would make a Christian a kind of chameleon, totally dependent on a new culture. There is no pure Christian anthropology incarnating successively in different cultures. From the beginning, Christianity was shaped both by the biblical tradition and by the Greek spirit. It is this concept of Christianity that should enrich creatively the new anthropological components of non-Western cultures in order to promote a global and polycentric Adventism. Thus, enculturation is about a fruitful and creative encounter between biblical and African traditions. It is about solidarity towards the fallen humanity and determination to work for the future of a reconciled humanity. Rogman affirms, Jesus Christ lived entirely as a Jew, as a Galilean, as a Nazarene. And by living this cultural existence, he expresses the transforming will of God in a countercultural lifestyle. Indeed, the personal lifestyle of Jesus Christ was largely countercultural, he says, with respect to this attitude towards riches, wealth, and greatness, towards women, the poor, and sinners, towards the Sabbath, that very revered of Jewish religious institutions. In all these and similar instances, Jesus Christ concretely and effectively challenged his Jewish culture in order to purify and transform it. As Okur, a theologian, says, he understands it, this countercultural mission resulted in opposition to Jesus and final in his crucifixion. This is the mission of Jesus Christ, was to live a life of self-emptying. This self-emptying allowed room for the true humanity that Christ lived out in humanity, in community with others, criticizing outward ritualism, false distinction between pure and impure, and other religio-cultural forms that exclude people or discriminate against them. Christ's steadfastness, selflessness, and courage based on his divine existence made it possible for his incarnation to function as inculturation. He continues and summarizes by saying, in the last analysis, the personal and cultural transformation of humanity, the birth of the new creation, happened first and foremost in Jesus' own person, in his own life, passion, death, and resurrection. In the past, we may not have regarded Jesus Christ's entire life on earth as one sustained act of inculturation, but that is what it was. Rogman also argues that in his capacity as the constitutive model of inculturation, Jesus Christ demonstrates the following aspects. Inculturation is a matter of cultural transformation. This transformation can only take place from within a relationship of immediate cultural proximity. This means that inculturation has both cultural and countercultural aspects. Inculturation is characterized by self-emptying. And number 5, the event of inculturation is also characterized by conflict. This calls for trust in God, courage, selflessness, and sometimes also for preparedness to suffer. The mission of the church is the continuation of the mission of Christ, which has significant consequences for the understanding of inculturation. Number 1, inculturation is an integral part of the mission of the church. Through Jesus Christ, cultures are to be restored in the church. And this presupposes that inculturation is seen not as endangering the universality of the church, but as realizing it. Since the various cultures come together within the church, the transculturality of the Christian message finds its expression in the transculturality of the church itself. Therefore, church needs to allow cultural plurality. Richard Niebuhr's Christ and Culture is one of the most significant theological and missiological works of the 20th century, offering a memorable categorization of the ways Christians have related to culture throughout history. Niebuhr's work begins with definitions. Who is Christ? He is the New Testament figure, crucified and raised from the dead, the one whom Christians accept as their authority. And then he asks the question, what is culture? It is the social life of humanity, the environment created by human beings in the areas of language, habits, ideas, beliefs, customs, social organization, inherited artifacts, technical processes, and values. So he goes on discussing 5 ways how Christianity and culture relate to each other. And I'd like to read it quickly. The number 1, Christ against culture. where sin resides mostly in culture. The church and the believer must establish a subculture with a firm boundary against the larger culture. Therefore, culture is an enemy of the church. Number two, the Christ of culture. The church lives at the center of cultural life, having no tension with culture. Culture is a friend of the church. Number three, Christ above culture. The church approves the good in culture and rejects the bad. The church holds the culture at arm's length, but approves its good features. Number four, Christ and culture in paradox. Culture here is neutral, and the line between good and evil must be drawn by individual believers. Therefore, number five, he says that Christ, the transformer of culture. In this position, culture is basically good, but it must be permeated and transformed by the gospel. Well, this model has been helpful, but not longer adequate to use today. The model is based on secular understanding of culture without theological interpretations. Number two, this model assumes a Christendom framework constructed in the era of Western dominance before the fragmentation of Western culture and the emergence of global Christianity. Number three, this model assumes a monocultural perspective that is very different from today's global multicultural world. And number four, the model assumes an eschatological framework that sees the future as already breaking into the present order, suggesting that God's kingdom has already been fully established on earth. Well, let's talk about faithful enculturation hermeneutics. It's both a process and outcome. And it starts with critiquing my own practice of Christianity in all its dimensions so that it remains biblically faithful and culturally appropriate in my own culture. Confronting the way one lives within his own culture is absolutely essential for enculturation hermeneutics in mission. The gospel is not linked to a particular culture. A few examples are the Jerusalem Council. From this time onward, Gentile Christians were not bound by the Levitical ceremonial regulations of the Jews, except for the provisions of the so-called apostolic decree, abstention from what has been sacrificed to idols, and from blood, and from what is strangled, and from unchastity. Also, different styles of proclamation. They were not proclaiming the same way. Another interesting aspect is the pagan words borrowed from the pagan word, repackaged. For example, the word logos from the Greek understanding of the meaning of that word. The words of Christ spoken in Aramaic and written in Greek, it's another example. Also, the first written Gospels, they were contextualized, and the theological foundation for the contextualization, which is the incarnation of Jesus Christ. Well, different terminologies have been used for enculturation of the gospel. The most known ones were created by Paul Hibbert and Charles Kraft, and they are known by, the term has caused some misunderstanding as critical contextualization by Paul Hibbert because of its mistaken linkage with higher criticism. Charles Kraft, another missiologist, he also coined a different terminology, and he calls it appropriate Christianity to avoid the problems of critical term, which Paul Hibbert had used. So different terminologies have been used for enculturation. But here we come to this process of enculturation hermeneutics, a suggestion from Paul Hibbert. The first thing that needs to happen when enculturation hermeneutics happens is to have an exegesis of the culture. The culture is, in this stage, studied carefully using the concepts of cultural anthropology and the participant-observant approach. It is uncritical, non-judgmental, sympathetic, and it researches what is not yet known, looking for deeper meanings, searching for hooks upon which to hang the gospel. And it points to, create points of contact and also bridges of entry. The second stage of this process of enculturation hermeneutics is the exegesis and application of the scripture. The missionary exegesis engages in a fresh study of the Bible with the local culture in mind, asking questions like, what does the Bible say to this particular people group? So it takes strengths and weaknesses into account. It affirms which is good and allow the Bible to judge that which is bad. So the critical responses and self-applications are important when the missionary get engaged in the community of believers in a thoughtful and unhurried discussion about the local culture and the Bible. So the goal here is to reach decision by communal consensus. The locals are always best able to critique their customs and apply the Bible meaning. And the leader must allow them to have ownership of their decisions. The local people have to live with their decisions. And the responses should always be sought when people are calm to decide. There are a few outcomes that are important here. Retaining elements that are positive or neutral. It's very important. Rejecting elements that carry deep, harmful meaning. Modifying elements by giving them new Christian meanings. For example, hymn tunes and other traditions or liturgical traditions. Number 4, the process number 4 is when we identify functional substitutes to replace practices that are to be changed or abandoned. So when people stop doing something, a disturbing vacuum is created that must be filled with something better. We need to find positive alternative options, substituting new rituals and symptoms borrowed from another culture. For example, burial practices. I remember in Burkina Faso, they had these burial practices of, post-burial practices of drinking and immorality, and the children would be abandoned. And the problem is that many members of the church would not go to these burial practices because they were immoral and they were disconnected from their families. So one day, after discussing with a group of members, one member came with the idea, why don't we still go to these meetings and we take care of the children who are all abandoned? And that has been the practice for many years now. The family are no longer excluding the Adventist members from their families, and they can still witness and give testimony of their love and the care for the children in the family. For example, adopting rites from Christian traditions, like baptism, Lord's Supper, or creating new symbols and new rituals. I remember in Guinea-Conakry, when the boy turns about 12 years old, he must go to the forest and have sacrifices and see the diviner and see, practice animistic rituals, and he must be abandoned and return alone to his home. Many of them die in the forest, others disappear, and when they become Christians, they become Adventists, there is a vacuum there that needs to be replaced. And in that church, specifically, we created a survival camp with the Pathfinders Club, when the boys need to go through a sequence of obstacles and demonstrate their manhood. Well, once that process is done with the local people, there is then the flourishment of transformational ministries. These transformational discipling ministries are needed for supporting the changes to be implemented. Redemptive church discipline is sometimes needed when changes are made involving practices and beliefs in place for centuries and generations. Time and support is required. In conclusion, the concept of enculturation seems to carry certain consequences for the shape of the church to come. Among them, the abandonment of the preference of a preference for Western culture and a greater diversification in Christian life and practice. The fields of enculturation include theology, evangelism, Bible studies, liturgy, religious life, marriage and family life, health and healing, ministries, and structures. Enculturation would therefore assume a relative pluralism in all these fields. Since enculturation cannot be imposed, but depends on the experience and initiatives of the local community, the concept seems to be to envisage ecclesial structures that favor increased participation and collaboration. The goal of enculturation hermeneutics is that the Word of God will dwell within particular cultural groups as authentically as Jesus dwelled among his own Jewish kinfolk in Nazareth. So when this happens, in the 21st century, believers will be authentically Adventists and authentically members of their birth cultures, immigrants' cultures, or chosen cultures. They will be both Adventists and Africans, Adventists and Arabs, Adventists and Fijians, Adventists and Gypsies, Adventists and Europeans or Americans or Filipinos or Latinos, all around God's diverse Word. Thank you.
Thank you, Pastor, for the presentation. Let us hear from another presenter.
Our next presenter is Pastor Watson Biruri. He is a PhD candidate here at IS, and the title of his presentation is Accessing the Greek Verbal System through the Shona verb toward a Bantu approach to biblical languages. Pastor, you are welcome.
Mane rakanaka ndokuchingamidzai kuchirongwa chino nekuteereresa kwenyu kunokosha zvikuru. Ndinotenda vaJoy Cruz, vaZuki Mxoli, pamwe chete navaKwabena Donkor. This is the sound, how Shona sounds like. And so, many times, when we talk about Bible and culture, what comes to me, at least to me, sometimes instinctively we think of, oh, culture is a problem. But in this presentation, the basic assumption is that culture can really be a very vital tool in helping us to access the Bible better. And I'm approaching here from a linguistic point of view. Can you imagine? It's so late in the day and we end with Greek. But I think this will be a beautiful ride. So those who like Greek, you enjoy. Those who don't like Greek, you also enjoy. Okay, so Shona is a language that is spoken in Zimbabwe and Mozambique and a number of other countries all the way up to Kenya. There are Shona groups in Zambia and so on in different countries. And so it is for my introduction here, I remember reading a paper written by a friend, Ron Genebago, encouraging or promoting that biblical languages should be taken seriously by people preparing for or training for ministry or to be Bible teachers in the future. And in the process of really arguing his case, he noted that for many seminarians or many people like who are studying biblical courses in college and maybe sometimes in seminary, taking biblical languages is usually characterized, he uses these words, grief, frustration, agony. And he notes that sometimes people actually opt to change course and maybe take other subjects which maybe may not require for them to have biblical languages like Hebrew, Greek, and Aramaic. And other scholars note that 80% of what people learn in these biblical courses, biblical language courses, is forgotten maybe within the first year or two of having come out of college, and is hardly ever used practically for ministry. Now, so what is the problem? Is it that these biblical languages don't like seminarians? What is the problem? One thing that has been almost continuously noted by scholars who are specialists in biblical languages is that there is a challenge. The first hurdle, which for many people is insurmountable, is inadequate grasp of English grammar. And so you're trying to learn Hebrew, you're trying to learn, in this case, we're talking about Greek. You're trying to learn Greek, but if my foundation in English grammar, which is the vehicle I'm using to access Greek, if this vehicle is defective, then I'm not going to go very far on that road. And we can understand Genebago's description: grief, frustration, and agony. This is what happens because of that defect. And so a number of books have been produced which try to remedy this challenge, like English Grammar to Ace Biblical Hebrew, English Grammar to Ace Biblical Greek. These are actual textbooks that have been produced as introductions. Before we get to Greek, maybe let's deal with your English grammar first, because it's hard to understand an infinitive in Greek if I don't even understand what it means in English, which is the vehicle I'm trying to use to access the Greek infinitive. So this is where the issue is. This is where the problem is. And so the purpose of this study, okay, I have the whole paper, and anyway, is to proffer a Bantu approach premised on Shona to the teaching and learning of biblical Greek as a more viable option to the traditional approach of using non-African languages to achieve the same purpose in the African context. So what we are saying is, long story short here I am from a remote village that GPS has never heard of in the eastern highlands of Zimbabwe. By the time English got to my village from England, it was already too tired. So, for me to use that vehicle to access Greek may be asking too much in some cases. This is the concept. Because Greek is a dead language. I mean, Koine Greek, the one that is used to write that was used to write the New Testament, it's a dead language. It's not spoken. Even in Greece, they speak, Greek, yes, but not that Greek. And so, for me to use a foreign language, English, to study a dead language, oh, come on. So is it possible that in my culture, African culture, I have a tool which is a language called Shona, which could actually be helpful in getting me where I want to get to quicker than English would? And this presenter supposes so, or presumes so. So the methodology basically is comparative linguistics. This is a method that has been widely used by linguists, and it was initially developed for the historical study of Indo-European languages. And there are 4 steps that we are following here. Number 1, identification of the 2 languages to be compared. In this case, it's easy because it's Biblical Greek and Shona. And then number 2, determination of the base language. Which language are we trying to understand? So the base language in this presentation or in my paper is Biblical Greek. And so, number 3, description of verbal elements of both languages. So we need to understand some basic aspects of the, elements of the verbs of these languages. And number 4, comparative analysis of identified elements. Now, coming to this picture, what did you used to see when you were young, looking at the moon? Well, when I was young, looking at the moon, just looking at the moon from my village, I would see an image of a woman carrying a bundle of firewood on her head. That's what I would see. I don't know what you used to see from where you were, from your village. But I don't think maybe someone in another part of the world would see exactly the same. Probably they would see something else. Maybe a bear. But I could have never seen a bear because there are no bears in my world. So what it means is the human mind rejects things that are disorganized. It always seeks patterns and order. And that patterning and ordering comes through connecting new information to old information which is already known and well mastered. If there's no dialogue between new information and old information, new information that is trying to be taught or learned and what is already known, if these two cannot come into dialogue, no effective learning can take place. So, English is a good language, beautiful, but I don't dream in that language. I dream in another. Could that language in which I dream help me learn Greek better? And so, when you look at, maybe we'll skip this one. So, I'm delimiting, in my paper I delimit my study just to the verb. We're not studying the whole language, all the elements of the Greek language. That's quite a lot of work. We're just delimiting ourselves to the verb, and not all the verbal forms, or rather modes, but only to the indicative. Why only the indicative mode? That is the mood or mode that tells us about facts, like it's night. That statement is in the indicative. It is night. It's stating a fact. Whether it's said in the morning or afternoon is irrelevant. The fact is saying that it is night. So that's indicative. And so the Greek indicative, or this mode, it is the predominant mode in Greek. So if one masters this indicative mood or mode, they will basically have mastered the heart of the Greek language. And so we are using the Greek indicative and the Shona indicative verb modes. So without a clear knowledge of the verb, one cannot interpret a Greek sentence. Exegesis is impossible and preaching is impoverished. That is according to Robertson and Davis. Now let's look at this here. This we have here. Look here. We have. This is some Greek infinitives. I have two of them here. This is dunamai luthein. Okay, dunamai luthein. That's a Greek expression, infinitive. And when translated in English is, I am able to loose. I'm able to loose like a rope, to untie. I'm able to loose. But look here, when translated in Shona, ndinogona kusunungura. In English, it's how many words? Count with me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. In Greek, it's how many words? 1, 2. In Shona, it's how many words? 1, 2. Do we see that? So there's something here, another infinitive. Dunamai luesthai. This is now in the middle passive voice. I'm able to loose for myself 7 words to translate 2 words in Greek. But Shona translates those 2 Greek words in 2 Shona words. So what's happening? What is it that Shona has which English does not? Which is making... So automatically I see here that Shona suggests itself to be a compact language, as Greek is. Shona is not Greek, but there's a compactness that my culture has imparted to me, which could help me. And, the word order is also the same. It's not changed. Of course, word order is something when we talk about Greek. And so, these are the tenses you know, when we are in the Greek language, the tenses are only applicable in the indicative mode. And so we're only talking about, the tenses here. The tenses that we are focusing on are the imperfect, the aorist, the imperfect, this is an action in the past, a continuous action in the past. It was raining when I got onto the jeepney or whatever. And then the aorist, this is like a simple past tense, I went to Manila yesterday. That's a simple past, And then future, we know future. Present, and then imperfect, something happened in the past, We can say Jesus has died for us. He died in the past, but the impact is present now and in the future. That's an imperfect. So these tenses are attested in Greek and also in Shona. And it gets even more beautiful as you go further in a very interesting way. So these are the, and let me, if I'm to mention the name of one scholar here, it is the name of Larry Richards. Used to be professor of New Testament at Andrews University. His book has made me love Greek. I never thought, at first I didn't like Greek, now I can't have enough. And so this, he gives us this paradigm. His approach is basically the scaffolding that I'm using for this analysis. And so he gives us the basic, personal endings that are used with verbs in the indicative mode, or basically Greek verbs. And so we have here the imperfect personal endings, and then we have got the present. These are the, primary, the basic. So these endings tell us something about number, and they tell us something about person. So is it first person, singular, plural, or whatever it is, and so on. And because these aspects are infused into a Greek verb, unlike in English where the subject and everything like that, those elements are separated. And so when you look at Shona, so up here in red, we've got Greek, and the lower part of the table is showing us in Shona, the Shona aspects. Shona doesn't use personal endings, but it's using, pronouns. It's working a little bit differently. It's using pronouns that are conveying the same aspects of person and number, and so on, And so, if we are to take these elements, so this is basically what I've done here in this table is to, or what this table tells us is that whatever Greek conveys using those personal endings, Shona also conveys. Although Shona is completely oblivious to the existence of Greek. But because somehow I've been brought into contact with both, I'm beginning to see some pattern. And when you look here at these basic verbs, for example, eluon, this is an imperfect right here, eluon, and it says here, when translated in my language in Shona, ndaisunungura. It's something that was, ndaisunungura pakwakatanga kunaya. I was losing the cows when it started raining. At the time it started raining, this is what I was doing. And so, it conveys, so whether we are in the present, luo, ndiriku luo, I'm unloosing, I'm untying, ndiriku one word in Greek, one word in Shona, like that. And then it goes to the middle passive voices, and then the basic Greek verbs here, we go on, and now, one of the key aspects that Richards talks about in his book, it is this particular, he calls these things minimums. Things that, his book is titled Read Greek in 30 Days or Less. In 30 days or less. And so, looking at that, he has got these, so what we have, what we talked about above, we've got the basic foundation of the Greek verb. That's what we talked about. And then when you come to this foundation, you build on it walls and put windows and everything using the tense identifiers for you to have a complete structure of the Greek verb. So, for the basic elements like the imperfect and the present that we started with above, we'll then take these tense identifiers to give us the rest of the tenses in the indicative mode of the Greek language. So, for example, this is future active middle. There is a sigma. A sigma is inserted. In Shona, for you to create a future, there's also a tense identifier, cha. Ndi chaenda. Once there's cha, it's future. And so there are tense identifiers which are also working at par, according to my observation. And there are quite a number of Shona speakers here, and who are also Greek experts. They are following closely, I'm sure, to what I'm talking about here. Okay, so this is not like some magic that I'm doing, because I know there are auditors who are really, really following closely. And so the tense identifiers are applied in a very specific way. We don't have the time to really go into all of that. But on the left side of that table, we are basically told that the tense identifiers are applied for us to know that this verb is in the past in Greek. Then we have to insert this sa, okay, sigma and aleph. And then this is giving us a past, okay? Yes, Luban is smiling. It gives us, a past, and so on and so on. And when it comes to the future, it's a sigma on the right side. And then when it comes to we've got voice, we've got person, we've got number. And so is it active, is it middle, is it passive? All these aspects are conveyed in these elements. And interestingly, in Shona as well, we also have these tense identifiers. The Shona language has these tense identifiers, like where Greek would put sa, okay, this sigma and aleph. Shona simply has ka. We would say kappa and aleph. Well, it's k and a. So it's ndakaenda, I went. Okay, it's already, that's a tense. It's telling you about about the past. And then what we also have, maybe let me talk about two voices, the middle and the passive voices. The middle and the passive voices. The middle voice is basically that kind of voice that we use when, in simple terms, it's a reflexive voice. When I say, I bathed myself, okay, I cut myself or something like that. There's a reflexive element. I carried out the action and I also received the consequences of that action. If it's active, I'm the one doing, I kicked the ball or Mbiri kicked the ball, okay? The ball is receiving my action. I'm kicking it. But if it's passive, I'm the one being kicked. And so, Greek has a beautiful way of telling us whether this verb is active, is it reflexive, is it passive, is the subject receiving the action of the verb or whatever, something like that. So Greek does that using those personal endings that we talked about earlier on, the personal endings. And Shona has a way of doing the same thing. If a verb is in the reflexive, it will have this particle, z. This is one of those that are very difficult for non-native Shona speakers to say z. Zandasara, Zichauya, or names like Musosi. They become difficult for non. You can always tell, oh yeah, this one. Okay, so for example, we've got examples here. Okay, so that is the reflexive. But if a verb is in the passive, Shona will not use z, but rather at the end, before the final vowel of that verb, Shona inserts a w. Automatically, that verb is in the passive. All words in Shona end in a vowel. All words in Shona end in a vowel. If you say a language and it doesn't end in a vowel, so one or two words don't end, it's not Shona. All words end in a vowel, including the verbs. So how Shona identifies the passive is by inserting a W before the final vowel of that verb that renders that verb passive. Okay? And so we've got here, basically, I appreciate this is too small. It's not meant really for us to absorb everything that's in that table. It's only for the purposes of, on the left side here, we've got, this is the Greek paradigm that gives you the indicative verbs, except the imperfect and the present. In fact, this is the paradigm. We can basically say this is the paradigm for the indicative verb. And you know the indicative verbs in New Testament are about 15,000. The subjunctive is less than 2,000. Imperative is less than 2,000. Optative is less than 100. So once you 15,000. And we've reduced that to this table. And so this is the Greek one. And this is the Shona one. There's no voodoo here. This is just clear. Fun. It's sheer fun. It was quite remarkable when I kind of observed this kind of trend. This is how it's, side by side, how it's working out. So could my Shona help me better access the Greek verb than English? Because it seems to me that English is taking me so many kilometers for me to come back here. Meanwhile, my African culture has gifted me with a tool that could have, if my teacher taught me this when I was in college, wow. Okay, anyways, that's why IAS exists, and it equips us and helps us, to learn and think in other dimensions. So we've got, basically what we have in all these tables, I've just zoomed in for a closer look into the same elements that I've already tried to explain on. Maybe, just before I finish, there's a difference. There's a, what can I say? There's a similar difference when you come to another aspect. That is when you come to the perfect. When you come to the perfect, those who do Greek, they know that there's doubling of this term, verbal stem. It doubles, okay? Leluka or something like that and so on. It doubles. And then the imperfect, okay, yes. For example, right here. Oh, yes, I'm looking at the imperfect, right? So the imperfect active has this tense identifier car, okay? But the middle passive one that removes both the tense identifier and what is known as the connecting vowel, okay? The one that connects between the verb stem and the personal endings. There's a connection there. It removes it. But when you come to Shona, this is actually reversed because in Shona, as you will see, you'll find that the elements are a little bit different here. Okay, Shona verbs, okay, with tense identifier, sorry, I'm a little bit, behind here. Okay, yes. Now we come to this particular aspect, ndasunungura. Okay, this is actually a Shona, what is that? Shona perfect, Shona active perfect, ndasunungura. Okay, and so in the active, Shona removes tense identifier, but puts the tense identifier in the middle passive. Okay, and so in the form of the reflexive ndazvisunungura or ndasunungurwa. Those are two voices. Ndazisunungura, that's a reflexive middle voice. Ndasunungurwa, okay, that W before the final vowel to give us a rwa. That is actually passive. It's telling us that this is passive. So let's conclude this. In conclusion, the findings of the study suggest that Shona is a highly viable option to teaching and learning the verbal system of Biblical Greek. The use of Shona in accessing the Greek verb could significantly enhance the teaching and learning experience of teachers and students respectively. And then connecting what learners need to know, that is Greek, to what they already know as provided by Shona culture. This is what could really make this whole thing so fruitful. A much less effective way is to introduce students to what they do not know, that is Greek, through the grammar of a foreign language they barely understand. So my recommendations are, number one, to start, the study has limited itself only to the indicative verbs. It is highly recommended that the other modes of the Greek verb system be similarly probed. These are the subjunctive, imperative, and optative modes, and also the participle, because Greek is a participial language. Together with that, we may also add like the infinitive. And so please take the participle. And then number two, this study focused on only one of the three biblical languages, that is Greek. It would be highly beneficial to, in like manner, explore the other two, namely Hebrew and Aramaic. Number three, considering that Shona belongs to a larger family of languages, altogether called Bantu, it is worthwhile exploring the possibilities that other languages in this family group also hold in relation to biblical languages. Fourth and last but not least, languages are just one of the numerous cultural elements that could bring Africa closer to the Bible and the Bible closer to Africa. The hermeneutically beneficial aspects of many others of Africa's cultural elements await exploration. The potential significance of this to Africa's experience of the Bible are great and worth every effort expended in that direction. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Pastor Mbiri, for that fresh presentation. I believe that you all have questions. I have questions, but we'll keep them. I suggest that we just write them somewhere so that tomorrow or the subsequent days, when we have more time, we'll ask them and they will be answered. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. From the AATA 7